I gave them 21 years, built every system, solved every crisis, carried the weight no one saw. Then one day my boss looked me in the eye and said I was too expensive. Just like that, gone. Replaced by juniors who didn't understand what held it all together. 2 weeks later, the calls started. Panicked, desperate, systems failing, clients threatening to walk. Now he wants me back, at any price. But some things once broken don't get fixed with money. You want to know what I did? You'll have to hear the whole story. Because this time, I was ready. He didn't even look uncomfortable. Graham Vickers leaned back in the high-backed chair like he'd done this a dozen times before. Maybe he had. His tailored suit didn't have a wrinkle, his hair was styled to precision, and his designer glasses caught the fluorescent light in just the right way to remind me who had the power now. "Nothing personal," he said. "Just cost-cutting." I nodded once. After 21 years leading engineering at Veltria Housing, through acquisitions, platform migrations, security threats, a global pandemic, that's what it came down to. Cost-cutting. My name, my work, my commitment, all filed under too expensive. Across the table, Diane from HR slid a folder toward me like it was a peace offering. "Severance includes 3 months' salary, accrued vacation, and healthcare continuation for 6 months," she said gently, like I might break. "Thank you," I said, voice even. Graham raised an eyebrow. "That's all?" I looked at him. He wanted something more. Maybe a fight. Maybe a dramatic scene he could report back to the board. Proof that I was unstable, bitter, unprofessional. He wouldn't get it. "What would you like me to say?" I asked. "You've made your decision." He glanced at Diane. She looked just as confused. My calm unsettled them more than anger ever could. But it wasn't calm. It was resignation. There's a difference. "Of course," Graham said, clearing his throat. "We'd like your help during the transition. The new engineering team could use some guidance on the system architecture. Maybe a few weeks of consulting work." I nodded again. "I'll think about it." I wouldn't. We shook hands. His grip was firm, performative. I didn't bother matching it. I walked out of that room, down the hallway I'd walked 1,000 times before, past offices I'd helped wire for connectivity, past employees I'd hired, mentored, stood up for when no one else did. No one met my eyes. Some looked down, some looked away. I didn't take it personally. They were scared. I'd just become a mirror. Proof that no matter how long you gave, how much you carried, you could still be discarded. My desk took 7 minutes to clear. 21 years packed into a single cardboard box. I left the extra monitor, the coffee mug, the backup drives. Only took what mattered, not much. As I stepped into the parking garage, my phone buzzed. "Vic, what the hell just happened?" Everyone's freaking out. It was Alan, my database guy, 12 years in. I didn't reply. I drove home in silence. No music, no news, just the low hum of tires on pavement. When I pulled into the driveway, the sun was low over Lake Ontario, casting long shadows across the water. Elaine met me on the deck. She didn't ask questions, just handed me a bourbon and sat beside me. Eventually she asked, "What are you going to do?" I stared at the horizon. "Something will turn up," I said. And I meant it. Because what Graham didn't realize, what he hadn't even bothered to find out, was that they hadn't just let go of a name on a payroll. They'd let go of the only person who knew how everything truly worked. I didn't say goodbye to many people. Not because I didn't want to, but because most of them couldn't look me in the eye. I walked back to my office with that folder in my hand, and that same hollow feeling in my chest that I'd had when I buried my father. That mixture of disbelief and finality. You know something's over, but your body hasn't caught up yet. I looked around the space I'd worked in for more than half my life. Framed architecture diagrams on the wall, sticky notes on the monitor, a whiteboard full of troubleshooting flowcharts and half-finished ideas no one else would understand. I stood there for a moment, then grabbed a single box from under the desk. It didn't take long. A photo of Elaine and me in Montreal, a few reference manuals I didn't need but couldn't leave behind, my personal flash drive, and the little brass gear paperweight the engineering team gave me after we hit 99.9% uptime for the year. That was it. The rest stayed, because it belonged to them, or because it didn't matter anymore. Outside my office, a few heads turned, then turned away just as fast. Some people were buried in their screens, pretending they hadn't noticed. Others whispered and avoided my path entirely. I didn't blame them. They were trying to survive. If it could happen to me, it could happen to any of them. That's what they were thinking. I was proof that experience didn't count, that loyalty was a liability. I nodded once toward the floor I'd helped design. Literally. I'd overseen the infrastructure setup when we moved into this building 10 years ago. I laid out the server room, spec'd the power systems, fought for extra cooling when the executives said it wasn't in the budget. None of that mattered now. I walked out carrying a box that felt heavier than it should have. Outside, the wind off the lake was sharp. I loaded the box into the back seat of my truck and sat there for a minute with the door open, listening to the gulls overhead, watching the sun start its descent. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Alan. "You okay?" Whole team's shaken. Still, I didn't answer. What was there to say? At home, Elaine met me at the door with that quiet kind of concern that comes from decades together. She didn't ask right away. She just poured 2 glasses of wine and led me out to the deck. We watched the lake for a while in silence. Finally, she asked, "What now?" I shook my head. "Don't know yet." But that wasn't entirely true. Because I did know one thing. The people who let me go thought they were cutting dead weight. They had no idea how tightly that weight had been holding everything together. They thought I was expensive. They were about to find out what cheap really costs. It started with 2 desktops, a fax machine, and a dial-up connection that dropped every time someone picked up the phone. That was Veltria back then, except it wasn't called Veltria yet. It was Bayview Properties. 4 apartment buildings, maybe a dozen employees, and a vision that barely fit on a whiteboard. Harold Bay, the founder, hired me from a consulting gig in Syracuse. He said, "We're growing. We need someone to build us something solid." I took the job because I saw the opportunity, not just to code, but to create something that could grow with the company, something built to last. No one else really understood systems engineering back then, not the way it needed to be done. I started with basic network architecture, got the property managers off spreadsheets, and slowly replaced the patchwork of tools with a single integrated platform. Lease applications, background checks, maintenance requests, payment processing. It all got folded into one system over time. I didn't just build it, I lived it, adapted it, kept refining it while the company scaled from a few hundred tenants to tens of thousands. And I did it without the support we should have had. I asked for more engineers. Denied. I proposed documentation initiatives, too expensive. I asked for QA teams, training budgets, onboarding plans. We'll get to it next quarter. That quarter never came, so I built anyway. Most of the code wasn't just custom, it was deeply specific, designed to handle exceptions that off-the-shelf systems couldn't. Redundancies were embedded in ways no one ever saw. Security was layered so precisely that even a minor misconfiguration would trip the system and lock it down. I kept records, diagrams, but I was the living documentation, because no one ever made time to do it right. And when things broke, they didn't go looking through files. They came to me. That's the part the board never understood. They saw a salary figure and a birth year and decided I was obsolete. They forgot the history that got them to where they were. Forgot that every time they acquired a new property or added a feature to the tenant portal or survived a data breach, it was because someone was holding the foundation together. Someone who saw around corners. Someone who knew what would happen if they chose speed over structure. But memories short in rooms where balance sheets speak louder than engineers. Harold retired. His son Justin sold the company. The private equity firm rebranded it Veltria Housing and brought in a parade of new executives who only cared about growth curves and slide decks. None of them knew what I'd built. Worse, they didn't care. They were too busy chasing trends to realize they were standing on a system that could only be maintained by someone who had built it with both hands. Now I'm out, and they're in. But I've seen this story before. You cut the root and the whole thing eventually falls. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing. If it had, maybe I would have seen it coming sooner. But the unraveling was slow, almost polite. The kind of quiet drift that doesn't feel like danger until you're already too far out to swim back. The first red flag came wrapped in flattery. A quarterly review where I presented a proposal for a proper documentation team. Just 2 people, even part-time. I made the case. Every quarter we waited, the risk grew. If something happened to me, no one would know how to manage the deeper systems. They smiled, nodded, complimented my foresight. Then came the budget excuse. Let's revisit next fiscal year, they said. That fiscal year never came. Next came the consultants. Young, polished, fresh MBAs with expensive shoes and jargon-heavy presentations. They talked about cloud-native scalability and disrupting the property management space. They sat in meetings with their tablets and buzzwords, eyes glazing over when I explained why our systems couldn't just be lifted into the cloud without re-engineering the entire backend. They smiled, thanked me for my insight, and recommended off-the-shelf solutions that didn't even integrate with our infrastructure. I pushed back, professionally, clearly, and with evidence. I showed them the fail points. I showed them the code. Still, they presented their slides like none of it mattered. And over time, I noticed something. Fewer invites to planning sessions. Fewer meetings. My input was being filtered, then phased out. Elaine noticed before I did. She always does. They're pushing you out, she said one night quietly as we cleared dishes after dinner. I shook my head. No, they need me. She just looked at me for a long second. That might be the problem. It sat with me for days. That thought, that I'd made myself too essential, that the lack of documentation, the depth of my involvement, the very thing that kept the company running might also be what made me a threat in their eyes. A system only one person can maintain is seen as a risk, even when that person is the one keeping it alive. Then they hired Graham. Graham Vickers came in like a bullet in a briefcase. Cornell MBA, background in fintech, and a clear mandate to modernize, which really meant standardize, streamline, and reduce overhead. He called me into his office 2 weeks after arriving, wanted to get a sense of the legacy systems. He asked questions that told me he didn't care about the answers, just needed to check the box before he started dismantling it all. A week later, he hired 3 junior engineers, fresh graduates, smart, eager, green as spring leaves. He said they'd be shadowing me, learning the systems. I nodded, answered their questions, showed them how the architecture linked across modules, where the data bridges lived, how we handled legacy migrations without breaking dependencies. They listened, they wrote things down, but they didn't understand. How could they? What I'd built couldn't be explained in diagrams and tooltips. It had to be lived, experienced, trusted. That's when the countdown started. I didn't know the date, but I knew it was coming. They showed up at my office door like students on the first day of school. Notebooks in hand, wide-eyed, polite. Graham had introduced them as our next-generation engineering team. And I'd played along, smiled, shook hands, asked where they'd studied. 2 came from big-name universities, 1 from a local tech institute, all sharp, all clueless about what they were walking into. I gave them access to the sandbox environment, walked them through the tenant lifecycle system, explained how the automated maintenance requests linked to vendor databases, how the payment gateways reconciled with legacy accounting software, how we managed cross-state compliance with modular subroutines. They nodded, took notes, asked smart questions. And yet, they missed the heart of it. They didn't see the interdependencies, how one misstep in the scheduling queue could cause cascading failures in 3 other systems. They didn't grasp why we hadn't switched to some slick SaaS solution like the consultants recommended. They saw complexity as inefficiency. I saw it as resilience. What they considered outdated, I knew was optimized for real-world scenarios, the kind you don't read about in textbooks. I didn't fault them, they were doing their best, but they were being set up, just like I was. Every day they stayed longer in my office. Every week, Graham visited less. The unspoken transition was underway. I wasn't training a team, I was handing over my job, brick by brick, quietly, without ceremony. One afternoon I stayed late after the juniors had left. I pulled up a code base I hadn't touched in 6 months, reviewed the lines I'd written, the comments I'd left behind. It struck me how much of this place lived in my head, how much I hadn't documented not out of secrecy, but out of necessity. I was always too busy doing the work to explain it to people who didn't want to listen. The next morning, Graham stopped by with a familiar casualness. "Quick check-in tomorrow morning," he said, barely making eye contact. "Just a quarterly thing." I nodded. I'd been through enough quarterly things to know when one came with a folder and a quiet HR rep. I went home that night, didn't say much to Elaine. Just made dinner, watched the lake darken, and waited. When I got dressed the next day, I chose a jacket I hadn't worn in years. The one I wore when I signed my first full-time contract with Bayview Properties. Back before they changed the name. Back when it still felt like a company that valued builders. I walked into that conference room 10 minutes early. Graham was already there. So was Diane. No need to explain. I sat down, calm. Not because I wasn't angry, not because I was okay, but because when you already know how the story ends, you don't waste your breath trying to rewrite it. They read their lines. I nodded, said thank you, stood up, and I walked out with nothing but my silence. It started with a voicemail. "Hey Victor, it's Graham. Just wanted to touch base. We're running into some hiccups with the tenant portal. Nothing major, just a few snags understanding some of the architecture. If you've got a moment, give me a call. Should be quick." I didn't call back. That was 13 days after they let me go. I'd been spending my days clearing out the home office, updating my resume, mostly pretending to be productive. But the truth was, I was decompressing. 21 years of firefighting, midnight patches, last-minute architecture pivots, all of it just gone. The silence had weight to it. No server alerts, no 7 a.m. check-ins, no Slack pings. Just the quiet hum of the lake outside my window and the occasional clink of ice in a glass. The next voicemail came that afternoon, then another by evening. The messages got longer, more urgent, less corporate polish. By the third one, I could hear it in his voice. Strain, like he was holding back panic with every word. I didn't need to hear the full story to know what was happening. I knew the system. I knew how fast things could go sideways when you don't understand where the fault lines are. The junior engineers were probably doing their best, but they were in over their heads. That system wasn't built for handoff. Not because I wanted to keep control, but because I'd been asking for a team, real support, for years, and they never gave it. I'd warned them. Quietly, repeatedly. I knew exactly where it would break first. And why. The next day, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Diane from HR. "Hi, Victor. I hope you're doing well. We were hoping to discuss a short-term consulting arrangement. Nothing major, just some support as the team gets settled. The compensation would, of course, reflect your experience." Translation. The system was breaking, and they didn't know how to stop it. I stared at the phone in my hand, then set it down without responding. Later that evening, I sat on the deck, glass of bourbon in hand, watching the lake catch the last of the light. Elaine joined me, wrapped in a sweater, quiet for a long time before finally asking, "They calling?" "Yeah," I said. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing," I said. "Not yet." Because I wanted them to sit with it. Really sit with it. Not out of pettiness, not revenge, but clarity. They needed to feel what it meant to lose what they threw away. Not just me, but the years, The depth, the knowledge they thought could be replaced by cheaper hands and newer degrees. Let the silence speak. Let the system answer for me. By the end of the second week, the polite voicemails stopped. They were replaced with chaos. The tenant portal crashed first, just like I knew it would. It always ran on a delicate balance of real-time and batch data syncs. Miss a config, and you bottleneck the whole flow. Suddenly, tenants couldn't submit requests, couldn't check payment status, couldn't even log in. The support queue blew up. Emails flooded. The front office got hammered with angry calls. I heard about it from Alan. He texted me in the middle of the night. Vic, portal's down. Nobody knows what to do. Maintenance requests are disappearing. The next morning, another voicemail from Graham. No more calm tone. Victor, we've got a serious issue. The junior team's trying to debug the portal, but the error logs aren't making sense. We think it's related to the routing protocols you built, but we can't isolate the fault. Call me as soon as you can, please. I poured myself a coffee and deleted the message. By that evening, the payment gateway had glitched. Again, predictable. The redundancy protocols were designed to kick in if certain thresholds were hit, but they required manual verification and staggered syncing. If you didn't follow the order exactly, the whole ledger would start throwing false negatives. Now rent payments were stuck in limbo, and tenants were either double charged or not charged at all. A day later, Diane called again. Victor, I know you've been getting our messages. We're offering a consulting package. Temporary, of course. $500 per hour, minimum 4-hour engagements, just until the system stabilizes. I stared at the phone a long time before answering. How generous, I said. She exhaled like she'd just touched dry land after drowning. So, can we move forward? I'll think about it, I said, then hung up. I didn't think about it. That night, as I was slicing vegetables in the kitchen, the doorbell rang. Elaine looked at me. I already knew who it was. I opened the door to find Graham on my porch. His tie was gone. His designer glasses sat crooked on his face. His shirt, usually pristine, was wrinkled like he hadn't slept. Victor, he said, I'm sorry to show up like this, but we have an emergency. The entire system's down. Nothing's working. The team can't even log into the admin dashboard anymore. We need your help. I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. That sounds serious. It is, he said. The board has authorized me to offer you whatever you want. $500 an hour. More if needed. Just tell us what it'll take. I didn't answer right away. I thought about the cardboard box in my garage, about the moment he looked me in the eye and called my career a cost. I have an interview tomorrow, I said calmly. His face flickered. I'm sure something will turn up, I added. Then I closed the door. And for the first time since he fired me, I felt peace. Not victory, not satisfaction, just peace. The email came the morning after Graham stood on my porch. Subject line, opportunity at Devlin Systems. I almost ignored it. I assumed it was another recruiter blast, some generic pitch for a short-term contract or part-time consulting. But then I saw the sender, Lawrence Devlin, founder and CTO. The message was short, direct, and unmistakably personal. Victor, I heard what happened at Veltria. I want you to know we've always respected your work from afar. We're currently planning a full rebuild of our infrastructure and looking for someone with your experience. If you're open to a conversation, I'd be honored to meet. I read it twice. Then again, not out of disbelief, but out of something else. Recognition. Not of the name, but of the tone. It was respect. No fluff. No desperation. Just someone who knew value when he saw it. We met the next morning in a small cafe downtown, neutral ground, away from boardrooms and executive theater. Lawrence was maybe 10 years younger than me. Casual dress shirt, worn-in leather notebook, no ego in sight. He ordered black coffee, no distractions. I've followed your work since the Bayview days, he said. That integrated system you built? It's a case study in function-first architecture. Not flashy, but bulletproof. Thank you, I said, unsure how to respond to something so rare. That's what I want. He continued. Not flashy, not trendy, solid, scalable, documented, maintainable, built to last. I nodded slowly. That takes time. And buy-in. Most companies don't have the patience. He smiled. We do now, after trying the fast route and watching it fail in spectacular fashion. I didn't have to ask for details. I'd heard whispers. Devlin had tried hiring a team of younger engineers who'd built them a sleek, modern system. One that crashed every time traffic spiked above 100 concurrent users. The support team had been drowning ever since. I'm prepared to offer you the position of Chief Systems Architect, Lawrence said, flipping his notebook closed. Full benefits, stock options, and a salary 20% higher than what you made at Veltria. You'd have full control over the rebuild, from architecture to documentation to training. It was a good offer. Too good, maybe. Why me? I asked. You could hire 3 juniors for what you're offering. He laughed. We tried that, and now we're rebuilding. I don't want cheap. I want right. I said yes, not because I needed revenge, not because I wanted to prove something to Graham or the board that cut me loose, but because it was time. Time to build again. Not out of desperation, not under cost-cutting pressure, not alone in a room no one listens to. Time to build something the right way. This time, with people who actually cared about doing it right. He showed up unannounced, same as Graham had. But this time it was different. Alan stood in the doorway of my new office at Devlin Systems, laptop bag slung over his shoulder, nervous energy written all over him. You got time for lunch? He asked. We walked to a deli around the corner. Nothing fancy, just 2 sandwiches, 2 coffees, and the kind of tension that comes with knowing you're about to say something that changes everything. It's worse than you think, Alan said, keeping his voice low, even though the lunch crowd couldn't care less who we were. They didn't just let you go to cut costs. It was a plan, a full strategy. I leaned back. Graham had been talking to the board for months before they let you go. He continued. He told them the custom infrastructure you built was too expensive to maintain, that we could replace it with off-the-shelf solutions and a younger team for a fraction of the cost. He pulled out his laptop and opened a folder. Emails, internal memos, meeting notes. All of it carefully archived, quietly pulled from the company's server before Alan walked out the door for good. One line stood out. I didn't even have to read it twice. Hale's systems are unnecessarily complex. He's made himself indispensable by design, not necessity. That was Graham, selling the narrative, pitching to a board that didn't understand what they were signing off on. He projected over $1 million in annual savings by eliminating legacy staff. I was first on the list. There's more, Alan said. The private equity firm that owns Veltria, they've been prepping the company for sale. Graham was brought in specifically to trim costs and dress it up for potential buyers. Suddenly, all the pieces fit. The push for standardization, the sudden disinterest in documentation, the obsession with short-term cost metrics. It was never about fixing the company. It was about making the books look pretty for a sale. And I was a line item that didn't match the story. I stared down at the email, jaw tight, heart steady. Not surprised, just confirmed. Alan leaned in. I quit yesterday. I'm not the only one. Half the IT department's gone. The consultants they brought in don't have a clue what they're looking at. Now Veltria's biggest client, Westbrook Properties, is thinking about pulling out. They've lost faith in the system. Westbrook was 30% of Veltria's revenue. If they left, it wouldn't be a fire. It'd be collapse. What are you going to do now? I asked. He grinned. Devlin hiring any database guys? Later that afternoon, I brought Alan's name to Lawrence. He didn't hesitate. Let's bring him in. We're building something real here. And I realized something as I watched Alan sign his offer letter. Graham hadn't just failed to understand the system. He'd underestimated the people who built it. The call came at 9:12 a.m. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the voice the second I picked up. Victor, Graham said, his tone stripped of all the smooth control it once held. Please, we need to talk. He didn't waste time. Westbrook's threatening to walk. Their legal team's involved. They're saying the system failures have damaged their tenant relationships. We've lost 3 other clients already. This is getting serious. I let the silence sit between us. Then he added, "The consulting firm says they can't move forward without you. They can't make sense of your database structure, the routing protocols, the redundancy layers. They need input from the original architect." There it was. Not the first time he'd said those words. Original architect. But the first time he said them like they meant something. "I'm employed," I said calmly. "Exclusive contract. I can't help you. We'll double what Devlin's paying you for just 2 days of your time. It's not about the money." He paused. I could almost hear him searching for a new angle. "Then what is it about?" he asked. "Revenge? Are you enjoying watching this happen?" I didn't answer right away. I leaned back in my chair, looked out the window at the lake in the distance, and exhaled slowly. "No, Graham, I'm not enjoying it. But you made a business decision. You weighed experience against cost and chose the cheaper option. Now you're finding out what that actually costs." He was quiet for a moment, then shifted. "The board wants to discuss bringing you back. Full salary, signing bonus, senior advisory role. No strings." For a flicker of a second, it almost landed. Not because I needed the money, but because there's always a part of you that wants the apology, the vindication, the retraction of every word that made you feel discarded. But I knew better. "You don't want me back," I said. "You want a Band-Aid, and the second you think you don't need me again, we'll be right back here." His voice hardened. The pivot I expected. "You know there could be legal implications, Victor. If we discover that you intentionally made your systems difficult to maintain, if you left traps or proprietary logic, there could be intellectual property issues, non-compete violations." There it was, the veiled threat. "The system is exactly as it was when I left," I said, even and flat. "Every request I ever made for documentation support was denied. Every single line of code belongs to Veltria. I've taken nothing except my experience." He didn't respond. "But feel free," I added, "to have your lawyers contact mine." I ended the call with hands steady, voice clear, pulse unshaken. Not out of coldness, not even out of anger, just certainty. Because this was never about bitterness. It was about respect. And if you have to beg for it after the fact, it was never there to begin with. Lawrence called me into his office one afternoon. No calendar invite, no formal agenda, just a quiet knock on my door and a simple, "Got a minute?" He closed the door behind me and gestured to the chair across from his desk. The mood was different, focused, serious, but not tense. "I just got off the phone with Jeffrey Westbrook," he said, folding his hands. "They're terminating their contract with Veltria next month. Too many outages, too much instability. They're done." I nodded, not surprised, just confirmed. "He wants to know if we can handle their portfolio, all of it." That made me pause. Westbrook managed over 10,000 units across the Northeast. If Devlin took them on, it would more than double our current operations. "We're not ready," I said. "Not yet. The new system's still in rollout phase. Documentation's halfway there. Migration tools are tested but not proven at that scale." I told him the same, Lawrence said. But then he made a different offer. He's willing to fund the infrastructure expansion himself. Full 12 weeks to prep. He trusts you. I blinked. "Me?" "I'm listening," I said. "And there's more," Lawrence continued. "Veltria's collapsing. The private equity firm can't offload it. But if we move fast, we could acquire them. Assets, client base, even some key staff at a massive discount." The thought hit hard. The company that discarded me could now fall under our banner. And I wouldn't just be watching it happen. I'd be the one guiding the transition. He let the idea hang in the air for a moment, then added, "If this happens, I want you to lead the integration, top to bottom. Technical authority, staffing, infrastructure. You'd own it." I looked out the window. The lake shimmered in the distance, calm and steady. the same lake I'd stared at after they fired me. "I'll do it," I said, "but on one condition." Lawrence leaned forward. "We do it right," I said, "from day one. Full documentation, training programs, no shortcuts, no we'll get to it later. Everything, documented, tested, understood, no single points of failure, ever again." Lawrence smiled. "Agreed. We've already learned that lesson." I walked out of that office without a trace of vindication. No anger, no gloating, just a quiet resolve. I wasn't coming back to fix their mess. I wasn't patching broken systems for the people who ignored every warning. I was building something new, something better, something that would last longer than any one engineer, any one manager, any one quarter. This wasn't payback. It was redemption, for the system, for the process, and for every unseen builder who ever got told they were just too expensive. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of what used to be Veltria Housing. The sign had changed. Now it read Devlin Integrated Property Management. Same building, same glass doors, same polished floors. But everything else was different. And this time, I walked in not as an employee, not as a casualty, but as the one steering the future. The acquisition had closed at barely a quarter of the valuation they'd flaunted the year they fired me. A fire sale. A technical rescue. But for us, it wasn't about picking apart what remained. It was about building something stronger from the bones. Lawrence walked beside me as we made our way through the offices. Some of the old faces glanced up, then quickly down again. Others nodded with a mix of guilt and relief. A few smiled, quiet, grateful. They'd survived the collapse and landed on their feet. They understood what this moment meant. Graham was long gone. So was most of the executive team that had approved my termination. Justin Bayou, the former owner's son, stayed on in a limited consulting role. He kept his head down and did what was asked. He never apologized. I never asked him to. We passed the server room, my old domain. Through the glass, I could still see the hardware I'd once specified, the blinking status lights of the systems I'd kept alive longer than most people stay at a single job. "Want to go in?" Lawrence asked. I shook my head. "We'll be migrating it all anyway." The systems were being rebuilt from the ground up, this time on modern architecture, with redundancies that didn't rely on one person's institutional memory. Every module documented, every handoff clear. The new hires were trained, not thrown in. The engineers were supported, not just expected to survive. In the main conference room, the remaining staff gathered for the announcement. Lawrence introduced me with a few brief words. "Many of you know Victor," he said. "He built the systems that powered this company for nearly 2 decades. Now he's here to lead us into something better, stronger, smarter, and built to last." I didn't give a speech, I just spoke plainly. I laid out the integration timeline, the training programs, the support every team would get during the transition. I promised no one would be left behind because of cost cutting. I saw the looks. They knew the irony. So did I. 1 year later, the migration was complete. Devlin had become the largest property management platform in the Northeast. Everything ran on the new system, stable, documented, scalable. On a crisp autumn morning, Lawrence called me into his office again. "The board approved your proposal," he said. "The technical education division is a go, full autonomy, build it how you want." That had been my condition for staying. Not a higher title, not a raise, a place to teach, to train the next generation not just how to code, but how to build. Because this wasn't about revenge. This was about making sure no one ever had to hold it all together alone again. This was legacy.